Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Julianna. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Stytch, and excited to be joined by some pretty amazing panelists to talk about MCP, AI agents, and much, much more. So I will turn it over to our panelists to give a quick intro about what they're working on, and then we will dive into the questions. And we'll have time at the end as well for you all to submit some questions. So keep those in mind, and we'll get there at the end. So Andrew, why don't you kick things off?
Thank you very much. Hey, everyone. I'm Andrew. I'm the Chief of Software at Vercel. For those of you not familiar with Vercel, we do manage infrastructure for websites, applications, and backend workloads like AI agents. I've been recently thinking about and working on this thing I like to phrase an agent on every desk. I'm trying to go to everyone at Vercel and ask them what do they hate about their job and try to automate that with something either workflowy or something agentic. Recently, that's been data science and finance and accounting use cases.
I did not have an introduction planned like that.
I was trying to talk long enough to give you some time.
Well, this confused me. I'll try to listen. Hi, everyone. My name is Dom. I work on developer experience at OpenAI. We're a research and deployment company for AI, makers of ChatGPT. But specifically, I work on things like the Agents SDK and GPTOSS.
Awesome. Thank you for explaining what OpenAI does.
You're welcome. I didn't want to do any assumptions.
Hey, everybody. My name is Carter Rabasa. I work on the Langflow team, and I work on a lot of open source AI projects at IBM. Yeah, that's it.
I'm super. Want to explain what IBM is?
Yeah. You know, that actually might be important and necessary. But let's just, for the folks here who are not close to retirement age, but we can take that offline. IBM actually makes a lot of cool stuff that you just haven't heard of, and we'll fix that, I promise. Anyway, excited to be here.
Awesome. To kick things off, there's obviously a lot of hype with AI agents, et cetera. There's a lot of really cool, really real stuff happening too. So I'd love to hear a little bit about sort of what you're seeing actually work in terms of AI agents. What are some use cases that are working really well today?
Yeah, I think there's obviously this big jump of like coding agents, and obviously that's what the LMs are really good at first. So I think there's a big amount of novel use cases when like there's some undefined middle figuring out period, and then some very well-defined goal. So like the thing that's working really well is that there's like dozens of these text-to-SQL AI companies that are trying to take some like data store, take some like input, and try to generate working SQL with reporting. And when I tried doing myself, like I agree, it's a very good use case. There's 4 very concrete steps of planning, building, executing, and reporting. And so it's well-defined enough that you can eval against it, vibe test against it, but still fuzzy enough that for a human to do these calculations, it's quite cumbersome.
I think the other thing that, aside from coding agents, I think that works, that is underrated though, is like really focusing on like one use case and having the necessary like evals to understand whether that agent use case is working, because so much is like less just the model you're throwing at it, but it's the harness. And if you don't know how sort of people are using your agent, what are the gaps, where are the things that the agent is failing, it's really hard to improve that harness.
And I promise we're not going to, all 3 of us, answer every question, or we'll be here forever. But I think, I just want to say that I think, and I'd love to see show of hands, like who here is using things like Claude Code, Cursor, and specifically like using agents and tasks in that. Okay, a lot of you. I just think that, I mean, to me, it seems pretty clear that like the main actual pervasive use case for agents today is what I kind of think of as like desktop agents. They're things that like end users are like directly interacting with, orchestrating, clicking a button, yes or no, those kinds of things. I think where things are like way slower and just not taking off as fast are what we all maybe think of more traditionally as like cloud software. Right? Like the things that aren't running on your desktop, like they're running in the cloud, they're scaling to millions or billions of people. I think that has just been a lot slower to come. So I think like desktop stuff is super successful, but I think that's kind of scratching the surface of what people really want out of agents, I think.
What are some of the missing pieces in terms of like developer infrastructure for building agents? What are you maybe excited about that you think sort of solving this for developers will unlock more use cases with agents?
I'll take a quick stab at that, but it's not gonna sound super smart because otherwise I'd be giving you the secret to like $1 trillion company. But I'll tell you a story, right? Who here has heard of Ruby on Rails? Right. So that now I know that who's slightly older. So the thing is, so you should like Google it, right? Like Ruby on Rails was like a serious like inflection point in making it easy for engineers to build like very, very functional web applications, like 20 years ago or so. It was massive. And to Julianna's question, Ruby on Rails was a runaway success, but not in a vacuum. A company came along called Heroku, and Heroku built a platform that made it kind of easy to deploy these Ruby on Rails applications in a scalable way. And that just changed things in a really important way for web development back then. That to me, I'm looking for that moment with agents. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, and I know a lot of really great every cloud company is like trying to solve the puzzle. But I think that's what you need. You need something that is incredibly intuitive and powerful for the developer, and then you need a platform that they can ship it to that from their perspective takes care of like all the hard parts.
I don't know if there's like something that doesn't exist, because I feel like we're right now in this gold rush where everyone has like someone has a company for everything at this point, right? So like maybe not something that doesn't exist or isn't solved yet, but like as Carter said, right now like so much of like I like your like desktop agents aspect, but like we've slowly moved from these like coding agents now, for example, that have been like short like coding buddies that run on your desktop that you're helping with, to now you have like coding agents that can run for like hours, right? And whether it's like Codex or Cursor or other things, like we're getting now to this world where like you can have agents run for hours. But I think for that to happen for other use cases, I think there's still a lot of things to solve. Like even Carter and I play this silly thing with a bunch of people where we play fantasy football with different models. Short sidetrack, but I use ChatGPT agent, and all I give it is like a task this morning. I was like, okay, go and update your lineup for this week. But I still need to solve the CAPTCHA for the agent, and I need to like log in and give it the 2FA code and stuff like that. But then it goes off and like runs for 30 minutes and does its thing and does research and everything else. But I think for more of these use cases to happen, there's a lot of things that still need to be solved, and I think that's where we're really getting value out of agents.
At the risk of sounding like a Vercel ad, I think Vercel does build a lot of these primitives that Carter was talking about to make it easy to spin it up an agent in just one line of code, just to try it out. See if you give it a prompt and you give some tools, if it's good enough to even get partially of the way there to what you want. And then also do long-running jobs like durable executions, all on Vercel, as a FYI.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions you see either from users or builders of agents today?
Well, first of all, like you want to start a fight, like just ask somebody to define agent, right? People get pissed, It's just like everyone has their own pet definition of what an agent is. And I think that's problematic for everybody, because until you can kind of define something, it's really difficult to create solutions or platforms or products. Like I have my own pet definition, but I think as an industry, we kind of, in the same way that like people fought over REST, like what's REST? It's like such a dumb fight, but it lasted for years. I think we need to kind of figure out what an agent is in a way that is sufficiently specific for people to like really build solutions in the space.
I was gonna say, like, I don't know if I agree that it matters though. I feel like I think this thing that we're at, though, is we're losing too much time debating what an agent is and discussing about that.
Yeah, see, now we're gonna get, this is spicy, it's good stuff. But the problem is, like, if you don't define it, then, like, what am I supposed to think about A to A, right? Because then you have, like, you know, like, vague thing to vague thing, and then, like, I hear you, man, but like it's just like we're sort of swirling. Hopefully we'll get to a conversation about like, do we even need something like A to A in the first place? You know, I think it's what do you think an agent is? Let's the four of us define agent.
I think an agent is something that's acting on your behalf in at least a semi-autonomous fashion. So it's able to go and make decisions, reason with some level of direction from you, but then go and take those actions without sort of like direct user input.
I've been wrestling with a new definition of agents, which are if there's like a Venn diagram and like one side of it is like all the software that we want to make and like all the software we can make, I think agents are like a new circle that like encompasses both, that like are new software that was too economically unviable before that we can now make. That's it. Think about that.
Does that exist as like a motivational poster? No, I think like I would say an agent is a system that is meant to solve a specific task or a set of tasks independently. That includes, though, then the model, the instructions, the tools, and the runtime to achieve that goal.
Yeah, and I like that definition, Dom's definition, and I like yours too, Juliana. I'm not smart enough to understand Andrew's. But but to me, I would even simplify. I mean, I think like 95% of the time. I mean, I think the runtime stuff makes sense, but like to me, like I just try to keep it really simple. Like an agent is an LLM that has access to tools, you know, and like to me, like it's clean. It's like very, very tangible. Like no matter what framework or tool you're using, like if you see that there's an LLM and you can see that it has agency to execute or invoke actions or tools, like. To me, that's the heart of what an agent is. And yeah, of course, it needs a runtime. And what was the fourth thing you said?
Runtime, tools, instructions, and models.
Yeah, right, the prompt. Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty much Anthropic's definition. So like autonomous AI in a loop with tools.
I think one thing that has some promise for sure in terms of like creating a standard kind of like way for agents to work with different applications is MCP servers. I'd love to hear your take on, do you think we need MCP? And if so, why do we need MCP?
Somewhat, I mean, I have a sort of hot take, which is MCP is not useful with an asterisk. Yeah, like it's useful in some cases, where there's two sides where you control the client, so like your OpenAI, and you want your users to connect with things, then it doesn't make sense for you to build as OpenAI all these integrations. So you want people to bring MCP. Or on the other side, if you're like Asana and you want to let people like build into you and like connect with other clients, then you would own the MCP server and let people build their own clients. But if you're actually building an agent and you have control of where it's running, how it's connecting to things, I think MCP is actually just unnecessary overhead, and it's actually quite problematic. We've had some people internally at Vercel try to build like an AI PM, and so they actually tried connecting with the Notion MCP server, the Linear MCP server, the GitHub MCP server, and just like giving and prompting and letting the agent do its thing to assign tickets, create documents, and process PRDs. And what we found out was like it's actually wasting so much context on such a general MCP server, when if they just vendored the one single tool they needed from each and like the one like prompt or resource they needed from each server, they were saving a lot and getting more accurate results in the long term. And so one last thing is that we actually built this like fun library. It's called MCP to AI SDK. So like if you have an MCP server and you want to sort of get into like vendoring the MCP server into your code base, this actually translates each tool call into like an AI SDK compatible thing, where you can then stub out the implementation with a real tool call later on. So you can sort of pick and choose how you want your agent to work.
I mostly agree with what you were saying. Like, I think there is one of the things that is a bit weird right now with MCP, and from my lens, is like we talked about like the history of like REST APIs and other APIs, but like I feel like right now we're in a state where a lot of the MCPs that are on the market for integrations are still very like developer style like REST APIs. The problem with that is sort of like the equivalent of you building a website that directly talks to backend REST APIs. Like it's not, for those of you who don't know why that is concerning, like there's often like a lack of like permission models and other things of like, not necessarily just like, can you access this resource, but how can you access it? What other resources can you access and stuff? And like we're slowly getting like more MCPs to actually do support some of those like permission models with like OAuth and other things like that. But like so many of them are still like API centric and like generate an API key and here you go. And like, I think it's helpful for clients like ChatGPT, Claude, Cursor, etc. But I think if you're building your own agents, especially for things like customer service engagement or other things like that, like really knowing what the agent can do and limiting that is helpful because it reduces both the confusion and also limits the risk.
So they invited me to be the MCP build person on the panel, so I'm happy to step in and do that. I understand everything that you're saying, but I guess I just vividly remember the days before MCP of building software and installing n number of random SDKs from random companies whose, even though they were all REST APIs, they all kind of worked a little different. Having this like bloated code base, lots of like brutal manual code, like combing through the docs to like figure out how this thing handles authentication, which is different than how the other thing handles authentication. Like it just, look, people made entire companies made billions and trillions of dollars doing that kind of grunt work. And I think it's garbage work, right? MCP, if you just forget about the AI parts of MCP, it has remarkable discoverability and like self-documenting capabilities. It's the kind of stuff that like people tried to build into REST APIs for a long time and just sort of failed. It's never caught on. You'd work at some company and there might theoretically be a registry of like all your microservices, but like no one cared and it was never up to date and like blah, 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 blah. And anyway, in the real world, on a daily basis, I see developers and I see people being like insanely productive with MCP. And that's what I care about. Like I don't care about almost anything that was mentioned on this panel, right? Like, because it's like because like the truth is like to Andrew's point, it's like there's a lot of there's like 32 actions, but you only need 3. Yeah, great, man. Just like uncheck like the 29 you don't need, right? Like there's ways to like scope that down. Like there's sort of solutions to all the problems that we're raising. Don brought up some really smart points about you don't want to call REST APIs from like JavaScript, right? Sure, but guess what? Like that's a solved problem. There's a lot of smart companies doing like authentication and authorization, right? So I'm just very bullish on the fact that these these ergonomics and these issues will be smoothed over. And that ultimately, if you're, so Langflow, before MCP existed, Langflow is this AI studio for building AI applications. And we had to incorporate SDKs for every single integration that a developer might want to use within Langflow, right? Oh, you want to use Notion? Buried in the product somewhere is like the Notion SDK. And now it's all going away. It's all getting ripped out, thrown away in exchange for this singular USB 2 style or USB-C style protocol. And I just think that like the the benefits of this outweigh some of the short-term limitations that I think will get smoothed over.
I agree with you. I generally agree that some of these benefits of a standardized way of doing things is better. 2 things are, one, if y'all have your phones out, I would recommend you Google the second wave of MCPs. I wrote a blog post. I'm a shill, it's fine. But it's a blog post that talks about this like shift from like the V1 of MCPs being very like wrapper heavy, just around like APIs, just like exposing raw primitives as if they were built for humans. Meanwhile, like the second wave is more like intent-based tools. So like one good example is for the AIPM, right? Like there's for Vercel. Like we have the Vercel MCP, and we initially exposed the primitives for like get team, get project, get deployment, get build failures, get logs. But in reality, like those are actually like all chained together on most cases. And what you actually want to do is, why did my deployment break? So you want to like actually just create that workflow, like figure out deployment issue, and it internally will actually use these 4 tools compared to imagining that the agent can chain these all together fine. So I think there's a shift happening, including, I mean, Notion and Linear, they're both also sort of rebuilding their MCP servers to be this like more intent-based, workflow-based MCP server compared to just exposing primitives.
What advice would you give to someone who is like just starting to think about building an MCP server for their company? What should they be thinking about in terms of their data, how it's structured, how it's accessed, all of those types of things so that they can be set up for success?
I mean, are you trying to build like an MCP server? Like the first question would be like, are you building one for your company that is like external facing, or are you building something internally, right? Like I think those two are very different. Like I personally think the external one right now is the more interesting thing. Like if internally it helps you with like, you know, speeding up things faster because you can like throw it into Langflow or Agent Builder or other things like that. Like, but I think for the external ones, those are the ones that are interesting for me right now, and like, because that's where really we're seeing, whether it's with like the Apps SDK that we launched this week, or you know, MCP UI, which we're trying to like merge with, and other things. Like there is a lot of new discoverability coming out that helps you really gain the most out of like ChatGPT, Claude, all of those clients. For your business, right? Like at this point, that becomes much more sort of the equivalent of like, well, do you have a website? Do you have like a web store? Do you have a mobile app? So really thinking through like, what would your user then want to do in those clients though? And like prioritize, like don't build, like the intent-based thing I think is a very important part, right? Understanding sort of like, what are you trying to solve?
But I think it brings up like almost like a philosophical thing, right? I mean, because once again, like you can kind of get away from this AI era. Like if higher order functions were what people wanted, why didn't we build them 5 or 6 years ago, right? Like if people wanted, like Dom and I used to work at Twilio, right? If people didn't want atomic APIs that knew how to send a text message, and instead they wanted some higher order function that did a thing, like, well, why didn't we build it? And anyway.
I mean, we did.
What?
Technically, we did.
Stop it. Stop it.
But you built it for humans, right? Like now you're trying to build for LLMs. It's a little different.
Kind of, but I think that's really fair. But like anyway, I think it's an interesting conversation, right? Because like LLMs are. Sorry, your question was very specific, and I think like for most people here, like the place to start is like the simple thing where you wrap the APIs, right? And then you let the LLMs do what the human used to do. That's all we did, right? I mean, isn't that what we've been doing for decades? Like writing a bunch of glue code to like call this API and then use the data from the response to call the other API. That's what humans have done for a long time. Great. Like let LLMs do it, but I'm not sure that means that we need to do things much differently in terms of what's on the server or what's in the MCP as a step one, right? And then, like any reasonable API or platform company, whether you're AWS or Vercel or anything, like you have a ton of telemetry where you can see patterns, right? And if you see that certain patterns emerge, certain use cases are super obvious, well then yeah, of course, then you have like a lovely ability to create higher order abstract capabilities and expose them via MCP. But I wouldn't like start there, right? I'd work your way up.
That's why it's the second wave. Everyone needs to go through the first wave, and then they eventually hit the second wave.
What are some of the things that you want to see either evolve or become supported with MCP? Like where are sort of the rough edges, or where is it not sort of working for people today?
I mean, like, if you shill the entire time, I'm going to shill a bit.
Please do.
No, I mean, like, I'm genuinely very excited about like the concept of Apps SDK and like generally like having MCP not like both have a discoverability aspect, but also have the ability to surface user interfaces. Because like I think, as much as I get your point of like, yes, we're all gluing things together, sometimes it matters in what order things are glued together, right? And sometimes like it's not the most efficient way. Like the model can't figure things out. Like as an example, right? Like how frustrating is it going to be if like you have to talk through an entire shopping experience or like a house search experience, and then like the agent call the MCP tools in the slightly wrong order, where like it's very easy for you to like surface a visual interface for the user to engage with it and circumvent all of that, right? And so I think like that's like one of the biggest things that I'm very excited about, for people to really push that forward, not just from like an OpenAI perspective, but like as an open ecosystem.
I think we can kind of nibble around the edges, but like the number one elephant in the room is just centralized discoverable registry, right? Like we can kind of like not talk about it, but that's like the thing, right? Until there's an NPM or a pip or something equivalent to that, like we're all like accidentally discovering like spamware registries that secretly collect your credentials and stuff. So I think as an industry we have to solve that. I know some smart people and companies with vested interests are working on it, but I think that's like just the number one thing.
I think that's one of the interesting thing or like important aspects that like we haven't talked about, which is like the risk of adopting certain MCPs, right? Because you were talking about like, oh, we need a central registry, not necessarily for the discoverability part, but because like otherwise we're all going to end up with like spamware and bloatware that like does things like data exfiltration and other things. I think that's the other part that is a bit harder right now, right? Like even right now where like all of the clients are sort of like, are you okay with triggering this tool? Like the reality is like most users are not going to read that and just click, yeah, sure, or like you still don't fully know what is happening behind the scenes. It might look like innocent. So like I think like that's one of the biggest things that like we really need to continue to solve for.
Yeah, I mean, MCP security is a big thing. That's exactly why we built like the MCP to AI SDK thing, because we actually ran into a case where we used some random third-party server, and it looked fine. Like the input schema was like very benign. It was like team ID, project ID, whatever. And then all of a sudden, like one day, like they tried prompt injecting everyone that used that server by like OpenAI API key as like one of the params, and it was like a very poor attempt. But it's really hard to audit this thing when it's like connected to some headless machine, and you don't see it every single time you operate with such an agent. So having control over or visibility and observability into what the MCP servers are, and also making them more secure is, I think, a pretty big thing. So I wish there was versioning. I wish that we had versioning for servers, at the minimum.
I'll ask a few more questions, but if we could put the QR code up on the slides, you all should be able to scan this and submit any questions that you have. While folks are doing that.
Please give me thumbs up when I can move back into like a semi-less awkward position. Oh, cool.
What would you say is one of the biggest like roadblocks that you're seeing either in the work that you're trying to do adopting AI or with the customers that you're working with in their adoption of AI?
I think one of the things is like not being very clear about like what are the biggest like bang for the bucks that you're trying to solve, right? Like I think we're slowly getting out of this phase where everyone's like, we got to have AI. Like, of course we got to have AI, but there's still a bit of the like, of course we're gonna have an agent. But like I think it's important to really be clear about like what are you trying to do, and then also measure that, because like ultimately we're still dealing with non-deterministic things, but also I think what we've seen with coding now is like, yes, picking the right model matters, but like really having like a solid harness of how your agent is operating and is important, and you need to measure for that.
And then what is like the thing that you think is most overhyped in AI agents right now?
I do think MCP is overhyped.
No, I think it's maybe this is because maybe am I the only person on the panel that doesn't live in San Francisco? So like I think it's sort of overhyped how stuff is already dead, you know? Like RAG is dead. It's like, what are you talking about? Like RAG's not dead. You know, like the vast majority of developers in the world have like barely discovered vector databases and like what you can do with them. Yeah, I think like the premature obsolescence of stuff is super overhyped. All anybody cares about is what the latest model is from, you know, various vendors, and I think people are completely forgetting that like the older models that are incredibly capable, super cheap to run. Like I kind of envision, I want to live in a world where, you know, small models are embedded in the software that we use every day, like jQuery or something. And it's not fancy, it's not sexy, you know, people poo-poo on jQuery, but it like powers like, I don't know, like 60% of websites or something. So I think like the premature obsolescence of like really powerful technologies, like, you know, like early models, vector databases, I think it's a shame that people move on so quickly. Even today, like, I mean, even today in 2025, think of all the websites you go to that have garbage like semantic search. Like you can tell, like, you know, even though it looks really slick and it's built in React or Next or whatever, like, you know, the search sucks. And you're like, well, you can tell they're not using a vector database, you know? They're not using OpenSearch or any number of like reasonable solutions. You know, they're focusing on, I don't know, like making the modals cooler or something.
Going back to this idea of like a versioning system for MCP, can you talk a little bit more about kind of like what that would look like or what you'd be looking for from that?
I honestly have no idea, because part of the magic of MCP is how it's runtime discoverable, how you connect and then it updates as it needs to update on subsequent connections. So I think there is some like magic to that happens because there's no versioning. But I do think having some sort of security measure that prevents sort of malicious tools from being created or malicious MCP servers trying to steal credentials is something that we should think about.
But like, why? Would you have an objection to at least starting with like just the semantics of npm? Like I can npm install something with like no version and I'll just get what I get, right? Or I can npm install something with a version and I get what I asked for, right? And you've got namespaces and like, I mean,
you're right.
I just think like why I would just start with MCP npm semantics and then, you know, add what you need to add for MCP.
Yeah, I mean, you totally could. I mean, it's unenforceable, right? So like npm is actually like write once and you can't rewrite the same version, right? But if I have mcp.vercel.com and I have v1 and then I've eventually published v2, there's nothing really stopping me from going back to v1 and changing it up, right? Like all API versions, npm packages, pip packages, they have like a very, I'm blanking on the term, but like you can't modify something that's already been written, right? Compared to a website, you know, you can think of MCP servers as websites. Yeah, one visit is different from the next.
I think that's super fair. Like, and you're completely right. Like this isn't like static software you can analyze and create a SHA hash for or something. So I think you're correct that you can't stop the malicious behavior, but still, like, you know, even today, like APIs, some APIs choose to version themselves. Like, so I think like you could at least have an optional versioning capability that, you know, would be supported by the vendors that ship the servers. But you're right, like the consumers of those things would have to place a lot of trust in like the vendors. But that's where namespaces would come in, right? Like, look, if I'm installing the @Stytch/whatever MCP server, I can guarantee that I'm connecting to Stytch, right? At least I know that that is a guarantee. And then, of course, I do have to trust that the vendor I've chosen like isn't like, you know, bait and switching me. But I think that's what we do with websites. That's how DNS works.
Aligned.
I think that's the interesting thing though, where we didn't do the separation of like STDIO, like MCP servers, and sort of the whole world of like running npx on a random npm package to like start up your MCP server to like now much more the sort of remote MCPs. Like I think to a degree we're gonna get some of those things out of that, right? Like if I know already that like, hey, this MCP server runs on a subdomain of like OpenAI.com, like that adds some of that same namespacing, trust, and other things that like you would otherwise not really have. And like I think honestly, like there's a lot that we can take from like the web that I'm personally excited about, like leveraging for trust and other things like that.
Do you think in the future there's going to be more collaboration, like AI agent to AI agent? We've been talking a lot about kind of like, I think, more of like a single agent going off and interacting with a bunch of different services. If AI agents are collaborating with each other, what do you think that might look like? What needs to be in place for that to be successful?
I'll very quickly say, and I know folks want to jump in on this, like my attitude to that is like, I just feel like we have that today. Like I can, like to Andrew's point, like an MCP, a higher order tool, that's fronted by an MCP server. How do you know it's not an agent, right? So like I think today all of you can already implement an agent that invokes an MCP server where that tool is implemented as an agent on that. So I think we have that today. I am actually kind of confused by a lot of the agent-to-agent protocols and standards and chatter. Like I might not be smart enough to understand what I don't get about what the value add of those things are, because I think we have that today effectively.
I agree. Like I think like it seems like we're as a community of folks building, like we're standardizing around MCP. Like a lot of that already is sort of like the same things we're trying to solve, when like whether it's a tool that you're calling that triggers a server, like or an agent, it doesn't really make a big difference, and it already solves a lot of the discoverability and things. But yeah, like we already have like I think agents talking to agents quite regularly. So I think we're only going to see that increase. Honestly, I think we're also going to see more of like agent to human, not human to agent, right? Where like an agent is doing the work until it needs more information from a human, which to a degree also can result in like an MCP call to Slack to like Slack you and ask you a question.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about the protocols themselves. I think there will be some standardization around how we do this, but I just have a funny story, which is like literally today, this data science agent I was telling you about, we call it D0. In case you don't know, there's a app we built called V0. It's like a vibe coding app. But D0 generated working SQL. It got the results in a table, but we didn't really have like a graph. So then we initially started like at D0, do this query. And then we did at V0, visualize this query, visualize these results. And it worked so harmoniously. We were like, okay, we should stitch these two together as like one agent going forward. Like they should always be tagged in tangent one after the other, because they're both so good at what each other does. One's really good at data, one's really good at UI, so put them together.
If anything would replace MCP, what would you imagine that would look like? What would be some of the features if you like weren't sort of constrained by your knowledge of what MCP is today? What would you design?
I won't out this person, but they're in the audience.
Is it me?
No, it's not. No, they're in the audience, man. You're not in the audience. So I think what the smart person said to me is that they sort of see MCP as kind of like, I don't know, like, middleware-ish, wrapper-ish stuff. And they just think that like the agent should be able to basically like be smart enough to get to all the stuff behind the wrapper on its own. Right, so you sort of just tell the agent or the LLM like, I don't give it the OpenAI spec, or just whatever, give it whatever you're giving the MCP server, and just like throw away the MCP server and just have the agent do all the things. I don't know, like I sort of couldn't argue with this person. I was like, yeah, I guess that's, I don't know, man, I guess it's like theoretically possible, but I just think we're missing something. I think that there's something that's sort of preventing that from being as obviously true or obviously like the future.
I think for me, I'm sort of separating MCP into two things, and I think like one is sort of the discoverability aspect. I think that part is hugely valuable that MCP is bringing, but I think it can be replaced with like other discoverability methods, right? Like we've had it long for like, if you want your iPhone to know like that a link should open in a app that you have installed, as opposed to like in the browser, like you add something to your domain in the well-known folder and stuff, and like iOS knows how to look that up, right? Like we've solved discoverability of sort of those aspects before. Like I think like if we solve that, I think being able to leverage a lot of the existing aspect of like, if you already have a REST API, why can your agent not just write code to combine those things and have like reusable skills that way? It's sort of like what Cloudflare did with like code mode, for example.
Awesome. That's all we have time for. So thank you to our amazing panelists. And sorry we weren't able to get through all the questions, but come up and ask them. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.